Welcome to the debate. If you are listening to this, chances are you've sat in a public university lecture hall at some point in your life,
Oh, absolutely.
right? And if you have, you probably know that exact feeling of sitting there, shivering in the middle of winter because the HVAC system you're relying on was installed during the Carter administration.
Yes, it's a very universal experience. I mean, you look around at the architecture, right? The thick masonry, those heavy load-bearing walls, and it all looks like it will just stand forever.
Exactly. It looks permanent.
Yeah, it's built to be this fortress of knowledge, completely immutable.
It is. But then you step into the actual world of sovereign public finance. You look at the deferred maintenance backlogs, the leaking roofs, those outdated heating and cooling systems that are now trying to regulate rooms filled with modern server racks.
Right, which they were never designed for.
Exactly. And you suddenly realize that physical permanence does not equal financial resilience. Suddenly, that fortress looks incredibly vulnerable.
It really is the ultimate paradox of public infrastructure. I mean, we build in stone, but we fund in sand.
Well put. And that paradox brings us to today's high-stakes fiscal summit. We are analyzing the future of Massachusetts public infrastructure. Specifically, we're asking a pretty profound question. How should the Commonwealth fund and modernize its higher education campuses in an era of rapid technological and economic disruption?
It's a huge question.
It is. And this tension emerges directly from two competing visions found in the source material we are looking at today. So, on one side, we have Senate Bill 2962, which proposes a massive $3.276 billion public bond authorization, and that is backed by tax revenues.
Right. The traditional approach.
Exactly. But on the other side is the Agile Campus thesis, which proposes abandoning state debt altogether. It favors 99-year ground leases funded directly by global AI consortiums. I will be representing the legislative defender perspective, arguing that the $3.28 billion tax-funded bond guarantees public sovereignty and ensures debt-free, democratically stewarded education.
And I'll be taking the agile strategist perspective today. I argue that relying on state budgets creates, fragile single points of failure. In this view, Massachusetts actually must unbundle its prime assets to import global capital and achieve true fiscal anti-fragility.
Okay, so let's jump in. Let's start by laying out the mechanics of the stewardship model, which is really the foundational core of Senate Bill 2962. We are looking at a $3.276 billion bond authorization, and the architecture of this bill is highly, highly intentional. Instead of just, vague promises, it legally ring-fences $1.25 billion specifically for deferred maintenance and modernization across state universities and community colleges.
Which is a massive chunk of the funding.
It is. And it also carves out $80 million strictly for decarbonization efforts. But the real engine of this legislation, the part that actually makes it work, is what I call the guarantee.
Okay.
The bill creates a dedicated capital projects fund protected by strict legal covenants. It's fed by a dedicated $125 million annual slice of the income surtax, which, many voters know as the fair share tax.
Right, the millionaire's tax.
Exactly. And this legislative path ensures that public land remains 100% public. It's governed by campus master plans and state priorities, not the quarterly profit motives of private tech corporations. I mean, it is a moral shield against private exploitation and a strict commitment to democratic stewardship.
See, I come at it from a completely different way. What you call a guarantee, I call an illusion of safety in an AI-disrupted economy.
An illusion?
Yes, absolutely. The Agile Campus thesis, version 2.0, is built on global market realism, not these nostalgic ideas of state funding, because the state's omnibus approach is fundamentally fragile.
How so?
Because it relies on a single tax stream. That $125 million surtax creates what engineers call a single point of failure. Think about it. If the state budget faces a structural deficit, or, if the macroeconomic environment shifts and the high-income tax base shrinks, the funding just dries up.
Well,
And if the funding dries up, the school fails. The anti-fragile solution, a system that actually gets stronger under stress rather than breaking, is to pivot away from taxpayer debt entirely
Okay, but pivot to what exactly?
to a site-specific Land Disposition Act. If you're listening, you might be wondering what unbundling a campus actually means in plain English. It means we take a massive asset, like the 32-acre Bunker Hill Community College site, and we separate the land from the state's balance sheet.
Right.
You grant the state authority to execute a 99-year ground lease with mega developers. We're talking firms capable of anchoring the site with AI ecosystem giants, like, NVIDIA or Microsoft.
Who have their own agendas.
Sure, but the AI sector is actively spending $700 billion on infrastructure right now. By tapping into that, we import global capital, we transfer the construction risk entirely to the private sector, and we turn a state liability into a market-backed asset.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what actually constitutes risk here. You argue that a 99-year ground lease is somehow safer than a public state bond.
It is.
But I want us to really think about this metaphor. Leasing the 32-acre Bunker Hill site to an AI consortium for a century is like mortgaging your family's historic farm to a volatile tech startup just to pay for a new tractor.
Wait, I hear the farm metaphor, but
Let me just finish the thought. You are introducing catastrophic mission drift. If the private entity's market priorities pivot in 10 or 20 years, which, let's be honest, is an absolute lifetime in the tech sector, what happens?
well, the market corrects.
Of an educational institution. The safety of the public bond is that the bonds are special obligations secured by a trust agreement. The law explicitly prevents the diversion of pledged funds.
On paper, yes.
It creates an ironclad democratic guarantee that the money will be there for education, completely insulated from market volatility.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why that legal covenant doesn't solve the underlying fragility. A statutory covenant preventing the diversion of funds only works if the funds are actually generated.
The fair share tax is generating revenue.
Right now, yes. But if income surtax revenues plummet during a recession, your ironclad guarantee is just an empty vault with a very secure lock. In contrast, under the market-backed model, you achieve structural anti-fragility.
By giving up control.
No, by transferring risk. I hear your farm metaphor, but it fundamentally misunderstands who holds the risk. We aren't mortgaging the farm. We are leasing the dirt underneath it while someone else pays to build a state-of-the-art facility on top.
Okay, but
And if an AI tenant fails or pivots, the global market is waiting to outbid them. We are talking about prime real estate in one of the densest talent clusters on Earth.
wait, hold on. Before you move on from that, if the AI company defaults, you're saying the state just gets a half-built server farm back?
No.
How does that help a community college? How does a bespoke, liquid-cooled data center serve a student trying to get a nursing degree?
Because modern mega developments aren't built as single-purpose concrete bunkers anymore. They are highly adaptable, mixed-use shells. If a tenant defaults, the physical asset, the land and that adaptable campus shell, remains intact. The lease transfers back to the state, and the project stays funded, without costing the taxpayer a single dime. You are insulated from downside risk because you aren't holding the debt. The private developer holds the debt. The state just holds the keys.
That's an interesting point, though. I would definitely frame it differently. Because you're assuming the only value of that land is its market yield.
Not the only value, but a crucial one.
But the value of public infrastructure is its ability to serve the public good, regardless of market conditions, which actually brings us to a critical divergence in these two models: the scope of the impact and statewide equity.
Okay, let's talk about equity.
The Agile Campus thesis is hyper-fixated on one prime, Boston-centric real estate parcel, Bunker Hill. But the Omnibus Bill is about the entire Commonwealth. It's a traditional influence model that leads by example.
Sure.
The bill ring-fences $120 million specifically for laboratory modernization and structural collaborations between community colleges and vocational technical schools everywhere.
Which is necessary, I agree.
Right. We're talking about facilities that support stackable credentials in gateway cities and rural areas, places that aren't sitting on 32 acres of ultra-valuable urban land. The tax-funded bond ensures that rural campuses receive the exact same level of modernization as Boston campuses.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered the mechanics of the lead domino effect?
The leads domino effect?
Yes, you are treating the unbundling of Bunker Hill as if it happens in a vacuum, but it actually solves your statewide equity problem.
How does privatizing a Boston campus help a rural vocational school?
By letting a high-value site like Bunker Hill act as a living lab, funded entirely by a fraction of that $700 billion global AI infrastructure spend, the state removes its most expensive, most complicated asset from the public ledger.
Okay.
That instantly frees up your $3.28 billion in bond capacity to handle the slower, less commercially viable rural campuses you just mentioned.
I see the math there, but
Furthermore, the Agile Campus model has a community equity engine built directly into the financial architecture. It utilizes a value capture model.
and how exactly does that work in practice? Because value capture, it sounds like a great corporate buzzword, but what does it actually mean for the residents?
Think of value capture like a toll booth on the massive profits of these AI developers. Because they get access to prime public land, a specific percentage of their 99-year lease revenue is automatically siphoned into a mitigation trust before it goes anywhere else.
A trust managed by who?
Managed publicly. And that trust funds local benefits that the state could never afford on its own. We're talking about tech parity through free high-speed fiber and AI literacy programs for the local neighborhood.
Okay.
We're talking about legacy subsidies for local small businesses and a developer-funded massive upgrade to the local public transit station. The market pays for the public good.
I'll admit the idea of getting $700 billion of private tech money to fix our schools and build our train stations sounds incredibly seductive. I mean, who wouldn't want that?
Right.
But I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because we have to interrogate the reality behind this community equity engine. Let's look at the PR pivot embedded in the Agile thesis.
The PR pivot?
Yes. The AI consortiums claim they want to be foundational education partners, right? Building a 16,000 student human compute pipeline. But isn't this really just a glossy rebrand designed to place energy-hungry data centers on prime public real estate?
Well, they need the talent just as much as the space.
But you are granting a 99-year lease to companies whose primary fiduciary duty is to their shareholders, not to the students of Massachusetts. A mitigation trust might pay for some fiber optic cable, sure, but it also sanitizes the fact that we are privatizing a public asset to serve the sovereign infrastructure needs of global tech monopolies.
Look, the state isn't privatizing the land. It's leasing the ground while retaining ultimate ownership. And you're right, the AI companies aren't acting out of altruism, and we shouldn't expect them to.
Exactly my point.
But they are acting out of a desperate need for infrastructure, power, and human capital. The market inefficiency here is glaring. The state has the land, but no cash. The AI companies have the cash, but desperately need a physical presence and access to talent pipelines.
So we just hand it over?
The mega developers act as the conduit between the two. The state's insistence on using tax-backed bonds forces the government to run a construction and real estate business, which, let's be honest, it is historically terrible at doing efficiently.
That is a fundamental misunderstanding of the government's role. The government is not trying to run a real estate business. It is fiercely protecting a democratic asset. And this is exactly why the regulatory frameworks in the Senate bill are so vital.
Vital or restrictive?
Vital. Instead of jumping into a lease, the bill outlines strict, transparent protocols. If a campus determines property is surplus, you don't just hand it to a developer. There must be public hearings.
Right.
There must be an independent appraisal, reviewed and approved by the Inspector General. And most importantly, it establishes vital reuse restrictions.
Which lock up the land.
Which protect the public. The law mandates that if the property ever ceases to be used for a direct public educational purpose, the title automatically reverts back to the Commonwealth. The role of government is to actively build public goods and legally shield them from being cannibalized by private markets.
But those strict protocols you just described, they're a perfect example of bureaucratic friction that prevents innovation.
Transparency isn't friction.
It is when it moves this slowly. The requirement for multiple public hearings, Inspector General appraisals, and rigid reuse restrictions, I mean, it sounds great on paper, but in practice, it just freezes asset utilization.
I disagree.
You end up with crumbling, half-empty concrete buildings because the state moves at a glacial speed while the technology sector moves at blink speed. By the time the state approves a blueprint for a modern lab, the technology meant to go inside it is already obsolete.
So we shouldn't do our due diligence?
The government's role shouldn't be to act as a general contractor pouring concrete. Its role should be to protect rights, regulate the environment, and secure that mitigation trust I mentioned earlier. Let the free market, which actually knows how to build complex mixed-use megaprojects on time and under budget, handle the infrastructure. The Agile strategy turns the government from a sluggish builder into a sophisticated regulator.
But that strips the public of its agency. The fair share tax, which secures this bond, wasn't just some random legislative idea. It was a voter-mandated directive.
I'm aware.
The public went to the ballot box and explicitly voted to tax high-income earners, specifically to fund education and transportation. Taking that clear democratic mandate and saying, actually, we're going to offshore this responsibility to related mega developers and global AI consortiums completely subverts the democratic will.
I don't think it subverts it at all.
Senate Bill 2962 honors that mandate. It requires that all projects be consistent in priority and need with campus master plans. These plans are developed in consultation with university presidents, faculty, and approved by the state.
Right, but
The decision of what gets built, where it gets built, and who it serves is kept in the hands of the public. It isn't buried in the restrictive, confidential covenants of a private corporate lease.
I understand the appeal of democratic stewardship, and I totally agree that public input is vital. But democratic stewardship requires solvency.
We have the tax revenue.
If the state takes on $3.28 billion in special obligation debt, it is locking itself into a multi-decade repayment structure based entirely on today's economic assumptions. You mentioned the $1.25 billion dedicated to deferred maintenance earlier, right?
Yes, it's a critical investment.
The very existence of a billion-dollar deferred maintenance backlog proves that the traditional stewardship model has already failed. It is fragile. It broke under the stress of time and budget cuts.
It was underfunded, not broken.
The Agile Campus thesis doesn't subvert the democratic will, it rescues it from insolvency. By allowing private capital to take on the financial risk of a massive site like Bunker Hill, the state stops spending money it doesn't have and starts investing in a resilient system.
But the risk.
We capture a fraction of that global AI spend to radically upgrade our prime campuses, and we do it without asking the taxpayer to underwrite the risk. If a market correction happens, the tech companies take the hit, not the teacher's pension fund.
Well, to summarize my stance on this, the fair share tax and the resulting $3.28 billion bond represent a profound democratic mandate. Public sovereignty is not a liability. It is the ultimate protection against exploitation. Through strict reuse restrictions, the legally binding guarantees of the Capital Projects Fund, and a firm commitment to statewide equity, Senate Bill 2962 ensures that our higher education infrastructure serves the citizens of Massachusetts. It leads by example through direct public investment, ensuring that our campuses remain halls of learning and do not quietly become the commercial balance sheet assets of global tech companies.
And to summarize my perspective, in an AI-disrupted economy, traditional state funding mechanisms are dangerously fragile. We are operating as a single point of failure.
Right.
The Agile Campus model recognizes that we simply cannot solve 21st-century infrastructure challenges with mid-20th-century debt models. By unbundling high-value sites and embracing 99-year ground leases, Massachusetts can import global capital and transfer the immense construction risk to the private sector.
Assuming the market stays favorable.
This creates a resilient, anti-fragile system. The market builds the infrastructure, the local community benefits directly from the value capture toll booth, and most importantly, the taxpayer is entirely shielded from the debt.
Both of these frameworks highlight a profound and honestly still unresolved tension in modern public administration. On one hand, we have the perceived safety and democratic accountability of tax-backed guarantees, knowing that the public owns what the public uses.
Yes.
On the other, we have the dynamic resilience and immense capital power of the global market, which offers solutions the states simply cannot afford alone.
Exactly. We are looking at two fundamentally different philosophies of risk management. One trusts the legal covenants of the state to protect the public,
and the other trusts the adaptability and immense wealth of the global market to provide for it.
Examining the broad legislative mechanics of S2962 alongside the site-specific financial architecture of the Agile Campus thesis reveals just how complex the future of public infrastructure truly is. There's so much more to explore within the architectural, legal, and fiscal details of this source material, leaving us all to weigh which path forward truly serves the public good.
It really does force us to step back and ask what we want our public institutions to be. I mean, are they meant to be isolated fortresses protected from the market, or integrated hubs of a much larger global economic ecosystem?
When we build the cathedrals of the future, do we rely on the heavy masonry of public debt hoping it never cracks? Or do we design a structure that flexes and adapts with the winds of the global economy? That is the question that remains.